Hi everyone, thank you for joining us. We'll be starting shortly, just going to let a few more people log in. Okay, so we'll look to make a start now then. Hi everyone, thank you for joining this evening's webinar. I'm Georgia Tipke, I'm the Vice Chair of YRP Northwest Region. I'd like to thank James and Robbie for joining us this evening to talk about their managed stations, how they're finding things during COVID and during the festive periods. You will have a chance to ask questions. Feel free to put your questions in the question panel and then I'll touch on them at the end. So if you just mind, James, would you mind giving us a quick introduction to yourself, your station, and how you've found yourself in your role?
Yeah, certainly, yeah. Thanks for having me. So yeah, my name is James. I've been with Network Rail now since September 2018. So started on the graduate scheme, got placed as part of the graduate scheme down at Euston Station, sort of by chance really. Moved down from Manchester down to London for that, and really enjoyed stations, got a lot out of being there, and sort of learned a lot from working with the station manager and the team there. Then moved into a shift manager role. I was keen to come back up to Manchester, so moved into a role at Piccadilly about a year and a half ago now. Started on the main shift station manager roster, so sort of acting as the duty manager for the station, and sort of learned a lot from that role. And then I'm still in a shift station manager position, but I'm currently off the main roster, managing a dedicated team on platforms 13 and 14. If you know Piccadilly, you'll know that obviously, certainly pre-COVID anyway, they were by far our busiest platforms and had a lot of issues with sort of overcrowding and the level of, particularly just the level of train service actually passing through those platforms, both passenger and freight. So back in January of this year, we had a new team, a dedicated team of 16 staff, start working on those platforms. So I moved into what my current role is now, which is basically line manager to those 16 staff and general manager responsible for the platforms, making improvements to the platforms and how we run them. So yeah, that's me. That's how I got to where I am now.
Okay, thank you for that. And Robbie, would you like to tell us a bit about yourself?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm Robbie. I'm a shift station manager at Liverpool Lime Street. Been at the station now 7 years from July 2013. Started off at Lime Street. I was a customer service assistant, but my predominant role responsibility was part of the security team, whose responsibility for compliance with the FT compliance at the station, but all security checks of the area. I was in that position for 4 years while shadowing SSMs at the station, getting to know a bit more about the dynamics in the background, station operations, obviously how we run a managed station. So I took a lot on board myself, basically tapping into stuff when I was on nights, working nights, going on systems with the manager's authorization to just get to learn a bit more off my own back, because I thought at the end of the day, it's better for me. I was new into the industry, never had any rail experience, and 3 years later, moved into the management role. Again, it's been a challenge every day. I like the challenge. I like knowing what's not going to be there either 5 minutes later. It could be up the wall, or it could be just plain sailing throughout the day. And currently sitting outside the roster for the past 6 months, where I'm looking at basically going into another position, but still within the station team, where I'll have a bigger oversight of operations at the station. So I'm looking forward to the challenge of that. But obviously with all the COVID, a lot of things are on hold at the moment. So we'll see what comes of it over the next couple of months with this vaccine, hopefully in the background.
Yeah, of course. You're dealing with a lot of uncertainty, and you have been for a while. Yeah. I couldn't help but notice your Christmas tree in the background, and it's got me thinking about how we normally deal with the festive works, and obviously the festive period in stations is quite busy. There's a lot of disruption. Yeah. In a non-COVID year, how typically would you approach it? That goes to either of you, Robert or James.
Yeah, well, normally a lot of it's planned in. It's been planned in for months in advance. We start pushing the message out, obviously, via social media, communication channels, obviously stakeholders through talks and that. So advertisements on the stations to let people know, obviously, dates of planned works that it will impact, obviously, on normal travel. So we try and obviously emphasise the fact that there is going to be disruption, because a lot of the big works are normally done around times, obviously Christmas time, Easter time, summer times, when we see it obviously reduced number around certain times of the year. But again, it's just about planning and getting the message out there to people, and it's working in collaboration with obviously station partners like, the talks and stuff, and pushing the message out there early enough to let people know that there's going to obviously be some sort of impact. But again, that we plan in the background contingency wise, where talks are put on additional, if you need buses, additional services, increased capacity. Obviously this was all pre-COVID. So a lot of it's planning, pre-planning, and planning on top of that, and having contingency plans in the background.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's much the same with us. I mean, every Christmas we produce a dedicated Christmas event plan, which covers most of December really. And obviously, I mean, that covers everything, including the Christmas markets and the additional Christmas footfall and all of that, and what additional staff we're going to have, how we're going to use them, etc., etc. And part of that is that we'll tie in the Christmas works, any shutdowns, any changes to service. We'll tie that into that event plan, and we'll sort of a plan appropriate for it in terms of extra staff, and then much as Robbie said, the comms side of it, working with stakeholders and all the rest of it.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. So obviously this year with COVID, and especially the second lockdown we've just had, and now the localized tier restrictions, has that had much of an impact on your preparations for Christmas this year? Like, is there more scope for maintenance because we're anticipating less people, or how's that impacted your stations?
It's a bit of certainly for us, it's a really tough one to call. It has been all year really, sort of since March. It's been a bit of a case of week in, week out, we're seeing changes. We're seeing changes in government policy. We're seeing changes in people's behaviour. So it's probably one of the harder ones we've had to plan in some ways. Just in terms of planning for Christmas in general, we're obviously expecting quite a rush between the 23rd and the 27th. So we're planning quite actively for that in terms of additional staffing, and that there's a whole other dimension to it. Whereas in the past we would have just brought in extra staff. Now when you're bringing in extra staff, you have to think about all the things like, where do you house those staff? Welfare facilities that we've always used in the past are now not big enough for social distancing. So there's all of those considerations. And then kind of going into that Christmas period, we've got I don't know, there's some wider works around the network, and we've also got some local works at the station. I mean, generally we localize those. We kind of concentrate those into the 25th and the 26th when we're closed anyway, which makes things a bit easier. But it's just a case of trying to plan around those known closures.
Yeah, and yourself, Robert, is there anything particular with Liverpool Street you found challenging with the uncertainty?
Yeah, it's different dynamic on everything you do. We're used to the hustle and bustle through stations this time of year. As you've obviously already said, Christmas coming up, we normally have Christmas markets in the city centre. We see hen nights, stag nights, Christmas parties. So it's normally a manic time at the station. Because we deal with that day in, day out, we sort of fall into not a complacency, but it's routine to us, and you manage things on the go. All the COVID, obviously, due to the football being drastically reduced, historically low football, it's put a dynamic on it that, I've seen station teams, it's what do we do? We've got no football in there. It's normally our business is managing people safely through the stations and managing, obviously, a managed station. So it's throwing a curveball to us. Obviously, being in Tier 2, Manchester being in Tier 3, we have literally been on a call today where with the transport cell that we feed in off them. Again, they're external to Network Rail. You'll have BTP, you'll have the Liverpool City Council feeding into it. And they're giving us figures for what they've seen in the city centres, opening hours. Obviously, where some of the shops have extended the hours in Liverpool to work, obviously later to allow people more time, so they're not queuing outside, obviously, or we've got to rush there while the shops are open. So it's opened the big dynamics to the outside as well as inside the station, and it's like trying to preempt something that we've never come up against before. So it is a big, like James has stated there, it's like a moving game, daily, weekly figures are down. We've seen a slight increase yesterday, about 7,000 to what we have seen, so it was 19,000 people. But we normally have 50 to 60,000 footfall coming through the station, so it's a big drop to what we have seen. But seeing some passengers back through the station yesterday was good. Having people actually coming through the station, but it's just what's the long-term future for the industry as well that I'm a bit concerned about. It's getting that football, then passengers, the confidence of them coming back to the network, and the impact it's currently having now, even though there's some positive signs in the background.
Yeah, Grace, as you said just then, this is something that we've never came across before. It's not something kind of we've ever had to really anticipate. Thinking back to kind of March time now, when everyone first got the, stay at home message, don't travel unless you need to. What was the kind of initial response from the stations back then? Because obviously you didn't know what you were up against, you just didn't know how long it was going to last. What was the mood in the stations at that time, and what did you look to do?
I think for us it was.
Sorry, James.
Sorry.
Sorry, that's okay.
I think for us that there was a bit of an initial burst of activity because obviously it all happened very quickly, really, and suddenly we went from having generally a very busy station. January, February of this year, we were on track to for the numbers to increase again, to be the highest this year that they'd ever been, which is kind of a pattern that we've seen over recent years. It does go up each year, and then went from that very quickly to actually this do not travel message, which actually, a do not travel message is normally, in the past, it's always been your absolute last resort. You don't want to tell people not to travel. It's only ever been in the past if you've had really severe disruption or obviously complete engineering works that are blocking a line. So that was a real about turn, really. So I think there was initial certainly from our side, there was an initial burst of activity of, okay, right, we need to get all the systems in place. We need a one-way system. We need hand sanitizer points. We need an enhanced cleaning regime. We'd started doing some of that already prior to the lockdown, but it was basically accelerating all of that, getting everything in place. And then staff accommodation, for example, we had to take over our upper concourse area as a staff mess facility because we literally didn't have anywhere big enough to account for 2 meter social distancing. We had to change all our rosters to bring fewer staff in on site. We had to start multi-skilling staff for contingency planning in case, obviously, we had too many people from a certain team go off. I think as Robbie mentioned earlier, there's certain security checks that we have to complete to a certain standard and a certain frequency to comply with the DFT. So there was all of that. And then I think there came a point where we'd kind of got the initial things in place. And there was definitely a period of pretty low morale within the station. I think the hardest thing to deal with within a station is boredom. As Robbie said before, we're not used to it.
Yeah.
And particularly my team started in January, literally purely as a passenger-facing team. Their whole role was crowd management, customer service, passenger assistance, all of that. and then suddenly to go from that to pretty much, practically no passengers using the platforms, and having 5 or 6 people on shift to look after those platforms was quite demoralizing for them. But I think we have moved on from there and kind of found a way of working.
Great. And yourself, Robbie, at Liverpool, how did you find that initial kind of shock to the system?
Yeah, it was a big shock. Like you said, we're used to keeping people on the move, and then government stance is obviously to keep everyone safe, where our obviously businesses keeping people safe, coming through the stations. It's flip of the coin. It's like travel now obviously is a non-entity, and that's, we rely on football, we rely on moving people. That's our business, obviously. And it was a big shock. It was a big shock for myself to see. People maybe thought might only last a couple of weeks, this, and then we can get things moving if we introduce social distancing. But I think obviously that it's had a larger scale impact, obviously, to every business, not just the rail. But I think we're lucky to be in the industry, because some industries are like at death's door at the moment, and the rail, due to still requiring essential travel and movements, even though it's minimal and free. We're lucky we're in the industry we're in, and I'm quite thankful at the moment I'm in the business of the, obviously, rail sector.
No, definitely. It's a really, really valid point. That's a kind of a common thread I've seen, not just with yourselves in the stations, but throughout YRP and everyone just in the industry, kind of acknowledging how fortunate we've been, really, that in the time when this has happened, we've found ourselves in an industry where, as much as there's the disruption and there's the low passenger numbers, it's still a vital industry. So we have definitely been fortunate. In light of kind of the lower passenger numbers at the moment, has there been any opportunities for the stations to kind of make the most of this unusual circumstances? Because obviously I imagine a big challenge in terms of doing works in the station is the fact that it causes disruption to passengers. Has there been anything you've been able to do while passenger numbers have been low that you mightn't have necessarily got a chance to do otherwise?
Probably locally at station level, probably not a lot, because again, social distancing requirements. We stopped basically non-essential work. Obviously, all other businesses the same. They weren't sending people out that normally do PPM at the station. Obviously, there was a lot of movement around track access and track works being conducted in obviously safe numbers, because again, they're normally manned at, big teams that are doing obviously big projects along the assets of the route and stuff. So it's been a can of worms, basically. From a station perspective, it's been again, there's not a lot to do outside. We move passengers, we interact with passengers. That's our business, that's what we do. To have no passengers in there, reiterate what James said before, boredom of staff, because some of these staff are dedicated. We have the mobility assistance team, so they're assisting, obviously that's their job, to move people that require assistance for travel. And with the vulnerable category and people, reluctant to travel because they're scared, that obviously the risk to them around COVID, we've basically gone down to 4 assists a day, as we beat 30, 40, 50 assists of a weekend, 90 assists a day for the team. So they're twiddling the thumbs, and they're dedicated to that role, obviously, of mobility. We have the security team dedicated to security aspects, so they're getting obviously on with the security checks again. But again, there's no obviously passengers at the station, where it makes it's that interaction with the passenger. It's more busy, so it keeps the staff on the toes, and it's trying to keep the morale up of the staff as well, because it's a harsh environment where you're in that sort of, we've got to keep people moving, essential workers, to keep obviously some businesses and NHS staff and that moving. But then we're putting obviously ourselves at the forefront of this, and at the start of it all, I think a lot of people were concerned about their safety as well, that they were still in a workplace, when the government stance was, if possible, don't travel and don't work. Obviously, the message where, if possible, work from home, and it's not possible in some of the roles we perform at the stations.
Yeah, of course. And yourself, James, with Piccadilly, were you able to kind of have any opportunities that arose through COVID that you might have necessarily had, or is it more along the same lines as Lime Street?
Similar lines, yeah. I mean, I suppose the only thing it's maybe helped with sometimes in terms of from a works point of view is we've been able to do some things that we would normally have done at night in the day, just because there's no passengers, or certainly, you know, in the evening as opposed to engineering hours overnight. But yeah, much the same as Robbie, our sort of works delivery team and kind of contractors that we frequently have in, we're generally, you know, avoiding any works that weren't essential, because obviously they were trying to minimize coming to site. So if anything, after the original lockdown, we had a fair old backlog of maintenance works that needed doing. So they've been gradually working their way through those, you know, just those kind of those small jobs that come up on a day-to-day basis that you couldn't necessarily justify doing during the actual lockdown period originally. But yeah, so I think, you know, now we're kind of there's still a fair few projects that we're kind of actively working on to improve the station more widely from an infrastructure point of view and from a kind of staff point of view. But we're sort of waiting to see what happens in the next few months, really industry-wide, because that will obviously impact local plans as well.
Yeah, of course. One like almost positive really of the whole situation is that train performance seemed to improve. You know, delays and stuff seem to minimize. Do you think that's a reflection on kind of the less capacity on the network?
Certainly for me, I mean, yeah, so the two platforms that I run, platforms 13 and 14 at Piccadilly, a lot of the delays for those were always passenger handling delays, as we'd call them. So on those platforms, one of the big problems has always been that generally you've got a 2-minute dwell time on those platforms timetabled in. So that in effect means that when the train comes into the platform, you've got 90 seconds to get all the passengers off, all the new passengers on, including anybody who might need passenger assistance, whether it's a ramp or help with luggage or whatever it is, get all of those people safely onto the train. And then realistically, you've got to do that within 90 seconds for the dispatcher to then be able to start the dispatch 30 seconds prior to it departing. So that was always really challenging to achieve on those platforms, just due to the numbers of passengers we had. You know, we were pre-COVID, in our busier months, we were on 35,000 to 40,000 passengers using those two platforms just in one day. So that was around about a third of the overall station footfall. So naturally that caused a lot of issues for performance, and that was part of the reason why my team was created, to kind of help manage some of those passenger handling issues. So obviously, yeah, come March 23rd or whenever it was, when we went into lockdown, we saw pretty much an immediate performance boost, just because the majority of those trains were coming in, and you know, they were often coming in early because they weren't having any passenger handling issues earlier in the journey. They were coming in, and you know, 30 seconds before departure, they were ready to go, you know, wheels ready to turn. So I suppose it has been a positive in some ways, but then equally you could say there's no use having good performance if you've not got the passengers to appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. Would you agree, Robbie? It's the same in Lime Street.
Yeah, definitely back to what James has said, 100%. Obviously, an amended timetable as well. Obviously, reduced services running, then obviously it makes it more viable for movement along the route, as where normally it's quite congested in certain areas. So I think that, as I said, backs up what James said, that you've got more obviously movement, more obviously free movement across the route, which adds to the no delays on the services, etc., which enhances performance time, which overall probably reflects good for Network Rail, because then obviously there's a lot of finances involved with delays to services and stuff as well. So again, it's a money saving exercise on another hand. But yeah, it'd be nice if we were performing like that when we have obviously a lot of passengers, but passengers bring again obviously along the issues, especially at weekends when we revert back to if it was business as usual. You get a lot of your delays when late services are going out, especially the weekends where you're waiting for intoxicated passengers, trying to get them along safely, and then this is where the delays come along, obviously, for certain services at weekend. But yeah, we're not currently seeing any of that because obviously no one's going anywhere.
It must come to something when you're kind of missing the intoxicated passengers.
Yeah, it's saying something. I never ever thought to say that after 7 years of being on the station. But yeah, it's just changed my perspective of, obviously, that's what we need. That's what we rely on, passengers. And yeah, obviously, if we get back to normal, hopefully we do at some point. Probably after 6 months of it, I'll probably be saying, "Oh God, I wish it was quieter."
No, and James, you mentioned as well that your main focus is platform 13 and 14. In the pre-COVID world, I used to commute Liverpool to Manchester every day, so I was always on that platform. So I've got an awful lot of sympathy for what you used to have to deal with. But obviously, because of working from home, I'm not having to commute. I know a lot of people are kind of hoping that this move to working from home some kind of stays post-COVID. I was wondering if there's any like working practices that you have seen during the pandemic that you maybe hope stay around, whether it's like the focus on cleaning or anything like that, just something that you think this is a good idea. Like, I wish we were doing this beforehand, and I hope we keep doing it afterwards.
So probably probably like work, a lot of works. Yeah, the stations never look cleaner. So the cleaning, obviously, we have a sub-service contract delivered to the station, and normally a lot of work has been completed under that, like high-level cleaning and stuff, where normally the station wouldn't have an opportunity to do that because obviously the passenger numbers and the time of day that we need to access certain areas. So I've seen a heightened, obviously, level, and on the like National Rail Passenger Survey, that was one of the things that used to get picked up at stations, like there's cleanliness and staff availability and stuff. So I'd like to see stuff like that continue. But again, it's around the dynamics of obviously passenger football and stuff. But a lot of that work has been getting done later on in the evening, which I think there's probably going to be lessons learned where we can adapt to the sort of challenges we face, and where we've adjusted to, what we've been faced with, and continue good practice with, some of these things at stations.
Yeah, definitely. And yourself, James, with Manchester?
Yeah, I mean, there's the saying, isn't there, never waste a good crisis. I think that there's always things you can learn, and I suppose it's forced us all to adapt in different ways. And I think, at the end of the day, it's one of the core parts of the job of any role kind of at a station, and certainly particularly any of the shift manager roles. It is all about adapting. It is all about seeing each situation that comes through the door really, and managing that in the best and safest way that you can in that moment. So COVID, I suppose, in some ways has been one long version of that. We've had to manage it differently, kind of almost week to week, as changes have come. Government policy has changed quite frequently. Obviously, it's been very much a new disease, and we've not really known, to start with. They didn't particularly think that face masks were very effective, and then obviously that changed to actually face coverings eventually becoming mandatory. So that there's been a lot of changes that we've had to kind of manage on a week-to-week, month-to-month basis. And I suppose the benefit of that is that it certainly teaches you to adapt. And certainly when it first started, we had a couple of weeks to completely rewrite a lot of our policies. The core things like how we do first aid. We had to completely reconsider how we do passenger assistance. A lot of the passenger assistance, obviously, as Robbie said, it was very limited. A lot of people weren't traveling, but even through the lockdown, we were getting the occasional assistance. For example, a visually impaired person or a person who's a wheelchair user who needed to come into the city for a medical appointment or something along those lines. We had to completely rethink how we did those assistances in order to keep it safe for our staff and for the person being assisted. So I suppose if there's any positive, it's maybe the rethinking exercise that came out of that, and perhaps there's some good kind of safety measures that we might continue on with later down the line.
Yeah, definitely. James, you just touched on it there, and no, Robbie, you mentioned it earlier about obviously, like other frontline workers, during the pandemic, especially earlier on when like face masks weren't recommended and they weren't mandatory. You mentioned before, Robbie, that a lot of the staff were uneasy because obviously they're still coming into contact with a lot of people, they're coming into contact with colleagues. Was there anything that was done within the stations to kind of ease them fears, and any measures put in place to kind of reduce the risk to staff?
I think like the national approach was pretty responsive. Obviously, I think we've done well across obviously the whole of the network. Obviously, come from the CEO that obviously to deliver the same message across managed stations for the same brand and stuff. PPE, obviously for staff, is one of the critical things, and because again, you know, look after your passenger, but the welfare of your staff as well, because we're at the forefront. Although we're not dealing, you know, like NHS workers, we have that interaction with passengers to keep obviously people moving through the station. Although, you know, contact with many passengers was minimal due to the low footfall. But I think we responded very good as a company and to push the message out there across managed stations. As I said, so we were all basically singing off the same prayer sheet and obviously the same stance. You know, the message was pushed out there. And again, practicing briefing staff on social distancing, the requirements of it, why it was important, obviously passengers, but for staff welfare as well, because, you know, again, your team, you're like a big family at the station, and your staff safety is, you know, paramount as well, because if they're impacted by anything, the shift managers that got it, like James has said here, you know, we manage day in, day out, with people managers. Besides passengers, we have to manage our staff and any obviously issues coming from them. So it's been a big challenge as a shift manager. But as I said, it's a rolling ball at the moment, and it's just everything daily. You've just got to take it as it comes and adapt, you know, go with what the changes are and government guidance and stuff.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think for us, it was probably the hard bit at the start was actually the side of working out how do we ensure staff welfare as far as possible, because we didn't know much, you know, in those first couple of weeks of the lockdown. You know, really we had such limited knowledge about how COVID-19 worked. Obviously, you know, just generally that it was still being worked out on a scientific level half the time. So we weren't always sure. So I think we produced a briefing pack early on that we briefed staff with, like Robbie said, around, you know, social distancing, but also, you know, just changing habits into, you know, using hand sanitizer regularly, the kind of PPE that would be worn for different tasks, all of that kind of thing. And that briefing pack changed a few times and had to get briefed out kind of repeatedly as it changed, because things did change. And certainly for us, one of the big things I think I mentioned earlier that we had to think about was actually mess facilities for staff. The space that we had existing was, to be honest, not really quite big enough before COVID. So then when COVID hit, there was absolutely no way that we could have 2 meter distancing in there. So with the retail units being closed, we just completely took over our upper concourse and installed a unit up there with a sink and a little kitchen and a fridge and all that sort of thing, and used that, you know, until we found a longer term solution. And then it was also around just trying to check in with staff as much as possible, because obviously there was a whole physical well-being with COVID and all of that, but there was also the side that we came up with emergency rosters where we reduced our staffing quite significantly, obviously just to reduce the number of people on site at any one time. But because of that meant for some people that 2 or 3 weeks at a time, depending on the roster, they could be maybe in work only for 1 or 2 days out of those 3 weeks, for example. And other than that, they were just on call from home. And obviously they couldn't really go out and do anything because it was the lockdown, and particularly some of them live alone. So it was also about, as line managers, trying to check in with them, make sure that they were still okay, and kind of also just manage the rosters in as fair a way as possible so that people were spending a bit of time in work and a bit of time not in work.
Yeah, no, definitely. That's the thing, isn't it, really? As much as it may seem great to be spending more time from home, like in a pre-COVID world, I think we'd all have loved to have said, like, oh yeah, I'll happily spend more time at home. But when you can only spend time at home, it becomes old really, really quickly. So we've been asked a question by the audience here, and it's for you, James. Basically, it's a question about if there is likely to be expansion in Piccadilly in terms of station platforms. So platform 15 and 16, because I know obviously you mentioned how pressed 13 and 14 are in the pre-COVID world. You get so much of the station's footfall just on them two platforms. So is there likely to be any expansion in the near future, would you say?
So there's nothing imminent. So certainly, obviously, platforms 15 and 16 have been back and forth for quite some time. So they were originally planned as part of a package of works that would have been delivered at the same time as the Ordsall Chord, which obviously linked us and Oxford Road up with Manchester Victoria. 15 and 16 never happened as part of that package of works. Obviously, the decision was made at the time that they weren't going to be constructed. It's kind of rolled back and forth since then as to whether they're going to happen. At the moment, there's no plans that I'm aware of for them to actually be constructed, but all of that will obviously would come from more of a Department for Transport level. It's obviously not something that would be decided anywhere near station level. Certainly, as the shift manager responsible for those platforms, I'm involved in a few different working groups that are looking at options for platforms 13 and 14. Obviously, 15 and 16 was always one possibility, but there are also things that we can do with the existing platforms. So the platforms themselves are pretty kind of, they're not in the best shape sort of physically. So there's been platforms in that location for a long time, but really the platforms in their current form were built in the 1960s and then extended in the 1980s. And the platform 14 side is built on a post-tension bridge structure, which basically means that we can't add any more load to it because otherwise it might fall down. So we've got quite a few kind of challenges there around what we could do, but there's a fair few ideas going around in terms of additional lift capacity, additional vertical circulation, changes to the canopies, and then there's also some wider work streams going on that consider Piccadilly, but also consider other stations along the line. Because the thing is, with 13 and 14, there's not really any point just making changes at Piccadilly, because if you do, you'll still run up against the exact same capacity crunches in other parts of the network, particularly along the Castlefield corridor. So there's other work streams looking at, for example, lengthening platforms at Manchester Oxford Road. I think there's some work going on around an extra bay platform at Victoria. I'm not totally sure. And there's also some work streams looking at kind of capacity on the Castlefield corridor more widely. So I think certainly from my view, there's, like I say, there's nothing kind of confirmed to be happening, but whatever does happen, we'll need to take an overall view of the network in central Manchester and solve the capacity crunches, not just for passenger management at Piccadilly, but for actually the management of the train service across the whole network in central Manchester.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. In reality, it remains to be seen how passenger numbers and demands across the network is going to bounce back after COVID. So such major infrastructure changes could be a long way off, really, because there's been some talk about kind of the flattening of the peak times, and there's been suggestions of maybe alterations to season tickets. So it's not, you pay for a permanent ticket. It might be that you pay for 10 trips and it lasts you however long. So there's definitely a lot of questions that kind of need to be asked across the industry as to how we please customers in a post-COVID world, a potentially more flexible working world. No, but thank you for clarifying that. We've got another question about how Liverpool and Manchester were in local lockdowns. Them announcements, especially earlier on in the pandemic, were coming quite late in the day. So I was wondering how you found it that you could get an announcement at 7 o'clock at night that meant that the next day you would have a lot of passengers, or you mightn't have a lot of passengers. Was there any kinds of working groups or anything that were put in place to handle that consistent change?
So for us, we did, back when COVID first sort of became an issue from March, we initially had a daily conference call with all the station stakeholders So with ourselves, the various top representatives and station managers, the BTP, Transport for Greater Manchester, all of those stakeholders and partners. We did do that on a daily basis, Monday to Friday, for a fair while. And then we reduced it to 3 times a week and then to once a week. And then, eventually it kind of just became part of our business as usual working, so that we didn't need that constant checking in anymore. In terms of the tiers, certainly for us at Manchester, there wasn't really any point where we had an absolute cliff edge. Suddenly we increased or suddenly we went down. Everything was reasonably gradual. And even now, obviously we've come out of the lockdown yesterday and gone back into tier 3. Yesterday we had about 33,000 people come through the station, which is still down. What is it? It's about 66% from the equivalent day last year. And considering that around this time we were well into the hundreds of into the kind of 120, 130,000 passengers a day, it's still massively down, and it's still not a huge increase from what we had in lockdown. So like I say, there's not been any kind of huge cliff edge surprises. So it has been something that we've been able to adapt to kind of over the course of a few days or a week or longer, rather than having to put in place massive changes overnight type thing.
Yeah, and yourself, Robbie?
Yeah, same sort of along the line with James. Not like major, besides obviously where we come out, we were in the high restriction, Liverpool, and obviously all the mass testing. I think it has had a good positive effect on obviously Liverpool overall. We've seen obviously the numbers are starting to drop on like the infection rate. Obviously we've been allowed to go into tier 2. I think that was probably more of a thank you off the government at government level to say, Liverpool has, gone out there en masse as requested to try and get tested, to try and obviously see sort of experimental, I suppose, because it was first in the country, and see what we could do probably as a region to see if we can impact on driving the number down, to try and obviously come out of these highest restrictions, because the impact it's having on, besides our industry, retail and that, it's all interconnected. At the end of the day, businesses rely on other businesses. And so, yeah, from what I've seen, obviously, where we've only just come out of the highest, obviously, restriction after lockdown, slight increase yesterday on the numbers, but that'll be monitored over the next couple of days. As I said, it was up by about 7,000 a day before to 19,000, which again, on our normal average daily footfall, it's still only at about 30%. So the station in the scheme of things is still pretty quiet, to what we used to managing anyway.
Yeah, definitely. With you being 2 separate stations, 2 separate cities, you are quite close. Like, there's so many trains every day between Piccadilly and Liverpool. Do the managed stations kind of keep in touch much? Do they communicate well typically, and has that increased during COVID?
Probably not much in the scheme of things. As I said, with obviously Manchester being in a tier 3 restriction, obviously government advice is only essential travel. So you wouldn't expect to see like a mass exodus of people coming from Manchester, although obviously we're going to have that sort of, attractiveness in the background now where we're in tier 2. So certain businesses are obviously open, where if you go in, you have a substantial meal, you can also have a drink. Obviously retail's open, so it might be a bit more attractive, to other areas that are in the higher restrictions. So I do expect to see, maybe a slight increase again on figures over the next few days. But as I said, we've reintroduced the COVID plan that we had initially, which we relaxed after we went into the second lockdown, because obviously there was basically no footfall coming through the station. It was like a ghost town. And we've seen a steady increase, obviously, a couple of days before, obviously, the lockdown come out. But, yeah, I mean, it's like with, obviously, Manchester, where you're saying about communicating each other. If there's anything, again, that'll impact Manchester and obviously impact Liverpool in the past for big events, I think, yeah. I said it's just a phone call, basically, for the shift manager or their control, to say. And, again, we've obviously got applications in the background, i.e. obviously that oversee operations of the station, where there's a lot of software, and you have LICC, Tyrrell, where it's all tapped into the route, so we can see what's going on at Manchester's area. We go into maps, if we get any feedback, if it's something that's going to, you know, have major disruption or be seen as a significant impact to either Lime Street or Manchester, I would imagine like that shift managers and station managers would be the first to obviously, you know, pick up the phone and say, look, this is happening here, so you could have some impact on, you know, further down the line at your station. I think it's pretty good between obviously the stations anyway, for stuff like that in general.
Yeah, no, definitely. Thank you for that. Another question has just actually came in for you, James. Again, it kind of centres around the platform 13, 14. Unsurprising really, because it's such a busy station, so I imagine many people are used to frequenting it. Peter has asked that he'd be interested to hear, in your opinion, whether the new approach to crowd management in platform 13 and 14 was showing signs of being a success, because obviously it's going to be potentially quite some time before we get back to them kinds of passenger numbers. Is there any lessons that have been learned throughout the new approach to them platforms that's going to be reapplied as passengers come back?
Yeah, definitely. No, that's a good question. Yes, obviously the team started in January, and then obviously only had really a couple of months. But even in that time, we learned a lot. We worked through a lot. So we'd had staff on platforms 13 and 14. Obviously, anybody that used the platforms will sort of remember we had staff from around mid-2018 when we had the May 18 timetable change, and things didn't exactly go wonderfully smoothly, as you might remember. So we had staff in from that point, but they were agency staff who, you know, there were some great staff members among them, but you know, there were lots of issues there. You know, often it was different staff from week to week, so it was very difficult to get any consistency. And you know, some staff had a really good approach, and you know, some came in with not such a great approach, and we didn't have much of a structure in place to manage that. You know, we had a couple of supervisors from Network Rail kind of overseeing the operation over there, but they didn't have a great deal of training or procedure or structure or anything. So definitely, I think that the new approach was the way to go, and it had been a fair amount of time in the planning. So obviously, back in January of this year, we started with the 16 staff, and then plus myself as a dedicated manager. And my job was basically to build that team into a kind of elite crack team that would, on a day-to-day basis, be able to provide really high-level proactive customer service, passenger assistance, and all the rest of it, and run the platforms almost like a station within a station. But then in the event of disruption and just in your day-to-day overcrowding situations that occurred quite frequently, would have that kind of knowledge and experience of the platforms to immediately be able to put in the appropriate interventions and actually intervene. The key for me has always been with crowd management, we shouldn't wait until we hit overcrowding. If we're overcrowded and we're getting to the point where we're concerned that it's dangerous, then we've really left it too late. Obviously, that, you know, there are times when you can't avoid it because it just happens very quickly. But generally, the whole idea was to have a team that really knew the platforms really well and could spot the telltale signs of when we were starting to get issues. They knew what kind of disruption would cause the major overcrowding, and they could start putting early interventions in place. You know, whether that be through the information we give to passengers, you know, getting people to remain on the concourse rather than coming to the platforms if the trains aren't coming due to the disruption. You know, actually communicating to people proactively via social media, via announcements, communicating with colleagues at other stations, all of that stuff. You know, working closely with Manchester Oxford Road, that's just down the line from us. So having that kind of consistent team that could put all of those proactive interventions in place and actually could try and divert people away from the platforms before they hit that point of being seriously overcrowded, and you have to put in, you know, heavy touch crowd management, i.e. closing down platforms. So I think that was going well. There was a lot of work still to do, and kind of, you know, what I'm really focusing on at the moment is still got those team of people there. They're actually a really great team of staff. We've got 4 supervisors and 12 customer service assistants. So there's a good command structure in there as well. So a lot of my job at the moment is building up training and competence for them, with them being completely new job roles within Network Rail. You know, we don't have platform staff generally in terms of a dedicated platform team at other managed stations. It's building up the competence for them. So, you know, understanding what what good looks like in their job role, how we assess that, and all the rest of it, and then building up that training so that hopefully at some point next year we will get back to higher passenger numbers and they're ready to sort of meet that challenge head on.
No, that's great. And I have to say as well, as a passenger on 13-14, there really was a noticeable change with the permanent staff and the familiar faces, and it did actually make quite a big difference to the passenger experience. So I do think it was really well done by yourself and your team.
Good, that's the right answer.
So we've had another question in from Ryan, who has said, as we've mentioned, staff working in rail on the front line and stations not running at full capacity. Is there any advice you'd give to someone who's considering a career in rail but is potentially put off by the uncertainty?
The advice I could give is it's basically on my experience alone, how we've met this challenge, how we're still dealing with it now. It's a good company to work for. Besides, obviously, what we're dealing with now, it's got many aspects to it, many tentacles. There's lots of career opportunity and development. But it's a good industry to be in. As I said, we rely on passengers. We need passengers back. It's a job for life, obviously, the way I look at it. Obviously, what's going on now, and hopefully, if these vaccines, around the corner sometime next year, we start getting back to pre-COVID levels. It's a secure future. It really is. It's a dynamic company. We've got lots of diversity in the company and different mindsets coming where we meet different challenges, i.e. the COVID. We're probably using technologies now that we never thought about, like this time last year. And this is where, as a company, we'll develop, we'll adapt, and we'll get better at things, hopefully, using technology like other industries, where they're using different software to monitor, numbers coming in and out of, obviously, shops now. And, they've got this traffic light system. Maybe at stations going forward, we can sort of adapt stuff like that at stations where we're getting busy. And like James said before, instead of waiting for overcrowding to happen, we need to adapt and move quicker, where we're more responsive to, what's going on at stations. And I think the way forward is technologies, and Network Rail is the type of company where we'll invest in stuff like that, because it's all about the passenger experience and managing expectations and, giving people what they want. Like any industry, you go out for a flight, you want stuff there at the airport, you want obviously availability of commercial units, choice, nice, surroundings, and that's what the company are aiming for. Accessibility for anyone. Years ago, the industry 10 years ago. So what we're doing now, 10 years ago, advancement in accessibility, as I said, mobility teams, and adapting to that challenge to making the stations more inclusive. We're moving with the times. Obviously, it's been a long time coming, but in my 7 years of being at the station, I've seen, things change over a matter of months. And I think a lot of stuff is coming out where it's moving a lot quicker now. And hopefully pre-COVID, we'll see a lot of change for the industry for the better.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that, Robbie. And James, yourself, I think you've been at Network Rail as long as I have. Is there any advice you'd give to someone who's considering a career in Network Rail or the rail industry in general?
Yeah, I think, Robbie's put it very well, really, that, in what he said, I think it's a great industry to work in. Certainly, like you said, been at Network Rail a couple of years now. I never planned to end up in the rail industry, really. I did a music degree. I'm still not entirely sure how I ended up here. But it's one of those industries that you join it, and I maybe thought I'd do the graduate scheme and then see where that took me, and I might well move on and go to a different industry. And from the first few weeks, really, there was no chance of that. It does hook you in because it's one of those industries where it's so vast. That there's a spot for everyone. I love what I do within stations, but there's plenty of people within our company that would probably hate what I do, but there's a niche for them. you know, whether it's something operational, whether it's something strategic, you know, whether it's one of the supporting functions, you know, all of those sorts of things. So I wouldn't be put off by the COVID sort of situation. I think it has obviously changed the dynamic a bit, but I think if you look at what's coming out of government still, and certainly if you look at what's coming out of the Department of Transport, they still want rail to expand in the long run, and they kind of need it to, you know, as a country. I think from a government point of view, they want to gradually move away from a reliance on road transport and cars. You know, that you need an alternative to that, and an obvious alternative is rail. So I think there is very much going to be a place for the industry long term. And I think there's going to be, although there is risk in the next few years, there's also a lot of opportunity there. So I'd say, you know, if it's something that you're interested in and you think you'd fit in the industry, you know, find your spot and go for it.
No, definitely. Thank you for that. And with young rail professionals as well, there's just so much diversity in the roles people do, whether that's people that attend events or people that are in the committees. There's so many different aspects of the industry that you never even consider. There's, you know, the engineers, there's the technical side, there's, you know, roles like my own in finance. Like it's so vast that there's definitely something for you in the rail industry, because it is huge and it's a really nice industry to work in. So that is all the questions that I have for you both this evening. So thank you both very much for giving up your time to talk to us this evening. I found it informative. I'm sure the attendees have too. That is the last YRP Northwest regional event for this calendar year, but there will be other YRP events. So feel free to look on the website or keep an eye on LinkedIn, because the links will be shared on there. If you want to get involved in the committees, just go to the YRP website and you can sign up there. But that is all from me. So again, thank you to our speakers for giving up your time, and thank you everyone for attending.
Okay, thanks very much, Georgie. Thanks, James.
Thanks.
Thanks. Cheers, Robbie. Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks.
Bye now.
See you later. Thanks. Bye now.